In a quiet town surrounded by ancient hills and dusty roads, there once lived a man named Rahman who had crossed the age of 55. His hair had turned silver and his face carried the calm lines of a long and thoughtful life. Rahman had never married, not because he hated the idea of love, but because his heart had always been drawn in a different direction. Since his youth he had admired the energy, laughter, and brightness of young men. Their dreams, their courage, and their warmth made his lonely house feel alive whenever they visited. Rahman owned a large old house built many decades earlier during the late colonial era. A house with wooden windows, a wide courtyard, and a garden where jasmine flowers bloomed every evening. Over the years many travelers, workers, and students passed through the town. But Rahman always found himself becoming close friends with the younger men who carried hope in their eyes. People in the town sometimes whispered about him, but Rahman had learned long ago that hearts choose their own paths. What mattered most to him was kindness, companionship, and the quiet feeling of belonging when someone sat beside him and shared stories late into the night. One summer evening, 3 young men who were his closest friends arrived at his house again. Their names were Arif, Sammy, and Zion. They were in their early 20s, full of life and curiosity about the world. Arif was thoughtful and calm, Sammy was playful and always laughing, and Zion was the quiet dreamer who loved poetry and history. They had first met Rahman years earlier when they were students who rented rooms in the town. Rahman had helped them when they needed advice or a warm meal, and slowly their friendship grew deeper. The young men respected him not only because of his age but because he listened to them with patience and never judged them. That evening they sat together in the courtyard under a lantern that glowed softly in the warm air. Rahman poured tea while Sammy joked about the long road they had traveled that day. Arif spoke about the changing times in the city, and Zion recited a poem he had written about loyalty and time. Rahman listened with a quiet smile, feeling the same warmth he had felt many times before, the feeling that life had given him companions who truly understood him. The town they lived in had a deep history. Long ago caravans had passed through its streets, and old travelers used to tell stories about friendships that lasted beyond generations. Rahman loved those stories because they reminded him that love and loyalty were not always simple or ordinary. As the night grew deeper, the conversation in the courtyard turned to those old legends. Zion spoke about a tale from centuries ago, about an older scholar and a young warrior who had protected each other through difficult times. The story fascinated everyone. Arif said that real affection was not measured by age but by honesty of the heart. Sammy laughed and said that the world often fears what it does not understand. Rahman felt a quiet emotion in his chest as he listened. He realized that the bond he shared with these young men was not something strange or shameful. It was simply human connection, a mix of admiration, affection, and trust that had grown slowly over time. Later that night the wind carried the scent of jasmine through the garden. The lantern light flickered softly across their faces. Sammy leaned back against a pillar and spoke about how Rahman's house had always felt like a safe place to them. When they had first arrived in town as young students, they had been lost and uncertain about their futures. Rahman had given them guidance without asking for anything in return. Arif nodded and said that friendship sometimes becomes deeper than family because it is chosen freely. Rahman looked at them with a gentle expression, feeling both proud and grateful. In his younger years he had often wondered if he would grow old alone. But now the laughter of these young men filled his evenings. They respected him, cared for him, and often stayed for days just to talk, cook food together, and share memories. In those quiet moments Rahman felt that love could exist in many forms, and that the most meaningful kind was the one built on trust and understanding. As the night moved toward midnight, the group walked into the garden. The sky above them was wide and full of stars. Zion began speaking about history again, describing how many great friendships had shaped the world. He believed that companionship between people of different generations could be powerful because each person brought something unique to the bond. Rahman listened carefully, thinking about the many years he had lived and the lessons he had learned. He realized that the young men around him had given him a reason to keep dreaming, even at 55. Sammy placed a friendly arm around Rahman's shoulder and laughed, telling him he still had the spirit of a young man himself. The moment was simple, warm, and sincere. There was no need for grand words because their connection had already grown strong through years of shared experiences. Time continued to pass, and the seasons changed as they always do. Yet Rahman's house remained a place where the four friends gathered whenever life became too heavy or confusing. Sometimes they cooked meals together, sometimes they argued about books and politics, and sometimes they simply sat quietly in the courtyard listening to the wind. The town eventually grew used to seeing the young men visiting the older man's home. People realized that nothing strange was happening there. Only friendship, loyalty, and the kind of affection that grows slowly when people truly care for one another. Rahman often thought about how unusual his life had been compared to others. He had never followed the traditional path of marriage and family, yet he had still found something meaningful: companionship with people who valued him for who he was. One evening many years later, Rahman sat again in the courtyard, while the sunset painted the sky with deep gold and red colors. Arif, Sami, and Zion had returned after traveling far away for work and studies. When they walked through the gate, Rahman felt the same warmth he had felt the first time they became friends. They greeted him with smiles and embraced him like family. In that moment, Rahman understood something simple yet powerful. Love does not always follow the expectations of society or the rules people try to create for it. Sometimes it appears quietly in friendship, in shared evenings, in laughter under old lanterns, and in the comfort of knowing that someone chooses to stay by your side. For Rahman and the three young men, their bond had become a story of its own, a gentle reminder that affection, respect, and loyalty can connect hearts across any difference in age or time. Rahman sat quietly in the courtyard long after the sun had disappeared behind the old hills. The sky slowly turned darker, and the cool night air began to move gently through the trees in the garden. The familiar sound of crickets filled the silence. For a moment he closed his eyes and simply listened to the peaceful rhythm of the night. Life had changed so much over the years, yet some things remained the same. The old house, the scent of jasmine flowers, and the warmth he felt whenever Arif, Sami, and Zion returned to visit him. When the gate opened and the three young men walked inside again that evening, Rahman felt something deep inside his heart move gently. It was not excitement like a young man might feel, but something calmer and deeper, a feeling of belonging. Arif greeted him first with a respectful smile. Sami immediately began talking loudly about the long journey they had taken, and Zion stood quietly for a moment before embracing Rahman warmly. The courtyard that had felt silent only minutes earlier suddenly became full of laughter again. They sat together around the old wooden table where Rahman had already placed a kettle of tea and a few simple dishes. The lantern hanging above them cast a soft golden light across their faces. Sami was the first to start telling stories from the road. He described the busy markets of the city, the noisy streets, and the strange people they had met during their travels. Arif listened carefully and occasionally added small details that Sami forgot to mention. Zion, as usual, spoke the least, but when he did his words carried quiet meaning. Rahman watched them the way someone watches a beautiful memory returning to life. These young men had once arrived in the town as uncertain students with little money and many dreams. Now they had seen the world, traveled far away, and experienced things Rahman himself had never imagined. Yet somehow they still returned to his small town and his old house as if it were their second home. The night grew deeper, and the conversation slowly became more thoughtful. Arif leaned back in his chair and looked up at the stars above the courtyard. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "I think the world outside moves too fast. People chase success, money, power, but they forget the simple places where their hearts feel peaceful." Rahman smiled gently at those words. He understood exactly what Arif meant. In many ways, his house had become that peaceful place for them. Sami laughed and stretched his arms behind his head. "That's why we always come back here," he said. "This place feels different. No pressure, no noise, just us talking like old friends." Zion looked at Rahman thoughtfully. "It's more than just the house," he said softly. "It's him." Rahman felt slightly embarrassed hearing that, but he said nothing. Instead, he poured more tea into their cups and listened as the conversation continued. Hours passed without anyone noticing. The lantern flickered gently as the wind moved through the garden. Eventually Sammy stood up and walked toward the edge of the courtyard where the old stone wall overlooked the dark fields beyond the town. "You know," he said, looking into the distance, "when we first met Ramon, I never imagined we would still be sitting here together years later." Arif nodded. "Life is strange like that." Zion stepped beside them. "Some connections don't fade with time," he said quietly. Ramon watched them from the table, feeling an emotion that was difficult to describe. He had spent many years believing he would grow old alone. The world often expects people to follow certain paths: marriage, family, children, but his life had never moved in that direction. Instead, he had built something different, a quiet life filled with unexpected friendships. Later that night, they moved from the courtyard into the garden. The moon had risen high above the trees, casting pale silver light across the ground. The jasmine flowers released their strongest fragrance during these late hours, filling the air with a soft sweetness. Sammy suddenly remembered something and pulled a small object from his bag. It was an old photograph taken years earlier when the four of them had first become close friends. The picture showed them standing together in the same courtyard, all smiling, all looking much younger. Ramon studied the photograph carefully. Time had changed them in small ways. The young men looked more mature now, and his own hair had become even whiter. But the feeling between them had not changed. "Do you remember that night?" Sammy asked. "Of course," Ramon replied softly. It had been the night when they first stayed at his house after a heavy storm flooded the town roads. What began as a simple act of kindness had slowly grown into a deep bond. Zion looked thoughtfully at the photograph before placing it carefully on the table. "History is full of stories about unusual friendships," he said. "Older teachers and younger students, travelers and guides, people from different generations who somehow understand each other." Arif smiled. "Maybe one day someone will write a story about us." Sammy laughed loudly. "If they do, they'll say we were the strangest group in the whole town." Ramon chuckled quietly at that. "Strange is not always a bad thing," he said. The young men nodded in agreement. The night continued peacefully as they spoke about memories, dreams, and the uncertain future ahead of them. Eventually Sammy grew tired and stretched out on a bench in the garden. Arif followed soon after, resting his head against a cushion near the lantern. Only Zion remained awake with Ramon. For a long time neither of them spoke. They simply watched the quiet sky above them. Finally Zion said softly, "You know, people sometimes misunderstand connections between generations." Ramon looked at him curiously. Zion continued, "But real affection is not about age. It's about respect, understanding, and trust." Ramon felt a quiet warmth hearing those words. Zion had always been the most thoughtful of the three. "Life gave me many years before I met you all," Ramon said slowly. "But these years with you have been some of the most meaningful." Zion smiled gently. The lantern light flickered once more as the wind passed through the garden again. Neither of them realized that this peaceful night would become an important memory in the years ahead. A moment when four lives quietly continued weaving their story together. And somewhere deep in Ramon's heart, he understood that the story of their bond was still far from finished. The morning light slowly spread across the courtyard as the sun rose above the distant hills. Ramon had been awake for some time, sitting quietly in his wooden chair and listening to the peaceful sounds of early morning. Birds were beginning to sing in the trees, and a gentle breeze moved through the garden, carrying the soft fragrance of jasmine flowers. For Ramon, mornings had always been a time for reflection. At 55, he had lived through many seasons of life, and yet moments like this still felt new and meaningful to him. Inside the house, the three young men were still asleep. Arif was resting on a small couch near the open window. Sammy had stretched out on a blanket on the floor after talking late into the night, and Zion was sleeping peacefully on the wooden bench in the corner of the room. Ramon looked at them for a moment with a quiet smile. These young men had once arrived in the town as strangers with uncertain futures, but over the years they had become something much more important to him. Ramon stood up slowly and walked toward the kitchen. The old house creaked softly under his steps. He filled the kettle with water and placed it on the stove to make tea. It had become a small tradition for them to drink tea together every morning when they were all in the house. While waiting for the water to boil, Rahman looked through the kitchen window toward the garden. The sunlight was beginning to touch the tops of the trees, turning the leaves into bright shades of gold and green. Soon the sound of footsteps came from the hallway. Arif appeared first, still slightly sleepy but smiling politely as always. "You wake up earlier than all of us," he said softly. Rahman chuckled. "When you grow older, sleep becomes shorter." Arif sat down at the small table while Rahman poured tea into 2 cups. A few minutes later Sammy walked in, stretching his arms dramatically. "I swear this house makes people sleep too well," Sammy said with a laugh. "I didn't even hear the birds this morning." Zion followed quietly behind him, his calm expression unchanged. He greeted Rahman warmly before taking a seat beside Arif. The 4 of them sat together at the table, sipping hot tea while the morning sunlight slowly filled the room. Moments like this were simple, yet they carried a deep comfort. No one felt the need to rush anywhere. The outside world, with its busy streets and constant noise, felt far away from this peaceful house. After breakfast, they stepped outside into the garden. The grass was still slightly wet with morning dew, and the air felt cool and refreshing. Sammy immediately began walking around the garden, inspecting the old trees as if he had never seen them before. "This place is like a little piece of history," he said. "Everything here feels older than the town itself." Rahman smiled at that. "Some of these trees were planted by my father many years ago." Arif looked around thoughtfully. "It's strange," he said. "Whenever we come back here, it feels like time slows down." Zion sat down on the old stone bench near the corner of the garden. He ran his fingers along the rough surface of the stone, as if trying to imagine all the years it had been there. "Places like this hold memories," he said quietly. "Even if people leave, the memories stay." Rahman nodded slowly. He had spent many years alone in this house before the young men came into his life. At times the silence had felt heavy, but since meeting Arif, Sammy, and Zion, the house had slowly become filled with laughter, conversations, and shared moments that turned ordinary days into meaningful memories. The morning passed peacefully. Sometimes they walked through the garden. Sometimes they sat in the courtyard talking about different things: their travels, their plans, and the strange experiences they had encountered in the outside world. Sammy told long, humorous stories about crowded markets and noisy city streets. Arif spoke about the challenges of work and responsibility. Zion, as always, shared thoughtful reflections about history and human connections. Rahman mostly listened, occasionally adding a quiet comment or a small piece of advice. He never tried to control their lives or decisions, but the young men valued his wisdom because it came from experience rather than judgment. As the afternoon approached, the sunlight became warmer and brighter. They moved back into the shade of the courtyard, where a soft breeze continued to flow through the open space. Rahman brought out some simple food, and they shared a relaxed lunch together. While eating, Sammy suddenly looked at Rahman and said, "Have you ever wondered what would have happened if we had never met you?" Rahman paused for a moment before answering. "Life would have been quieter," he said with a gentle smile. Arif nodded. "Ours too." Zion looked at Rahman thoughtfully. "Some people change the direction of our lives without even trying." For a moment no one spoke. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncomfortable. Each of them understood that the bond between them had grown stronger than simple friendship. It was built on years of trust, respect, and shared experiences. As evening approached, the sky slowly turned orange and red above the garden. The 4 friends sat together once again in the courtyard, watching the sunset paint the sky with warm colors. Rahman leaned back in his chair, feeling grateful for the unusual path his life had taken. He had never followed the traditional road of marriage and family, but he had still found companionship in an unexpected way. The young men around him had brought energy and warmth into his quiet world. In return, he had given them a place where they could feel safe, understood, and accepted. Sammy suddenly pointed toward the sky where the first star had appeared. "Look," he said with a smile. "The night is starting again." Arif laughed softly. And we'll probably stay up talking until midnight again. Zion looked at Rahman and said quietly, some nights are too peaceful to waste sleeping. Rahman smiled warmly at those words. In that moment, sitting together beneath the slowly darkening sky, the four of them felt a deep sense of connection. Life might take them to different places in the future, but the memories they were creating here would always remain part of their story. And somewhere deep inside, Rahman knew that this story, their story, was still continuing, slowly unfolding with every passing day. The evening slowly deepened around the old house as darkness gently covered the sky. One by one the stars began to appear above the quiet town, shining softly like small distant lanterns. The courtyard was calm, and the lantern hanging near the wooden pillar cast a warm golden light across the table where Rahman and the three young men were sitting. The peaceful atmosphere made the moment feel almost timeless. Sammy leaned back in his chair and looked toward the sky with a relaxed smile. Every time we come here, he said, it feels like we step into another world. Arif nodded slowly. A slower world. Zion remained quiet for a moment, observing the shadows of the trees moving gently in the night breeze. Then he said thoughtfully, maybe not another world, just a place where people remember how to breathe. Rahman listened to them with a calm expression. Their words often surprised him. Even though they were young, they sometimes spoke with a depth that many older people never reached. Over the years he had learned that wisdom did not belong only to age. Sometimes youth carried its own kind of understanding. The lantern light flickered softly as the wind passed through the courtyard. Rahman stood up and brought another kettle of tea from the kitchen. Preparing tea had become almost a ritual during their nights together. It was simple, but it created a feeling of comfort that none of them wanted to break. While Rahman poured the tea, Sammy suddenly laughed quietly. You know something strange? He said. Arif raised an eyebrow. What now? Sammy looked at Rahman and said, when we first came to this town, I thought we would stay here only a few months. I never imagined we would still be coming back years later. Rahman smiled slightly. Life often takes us to places we never planned to stay. Zion gently turned the cup of tea in his hands, watching the steam rise into the cool air. Sometimes the places we choose are not as important as the people we meet there, he said softly. For a moment, silence settled among them again. But it was the kind of silence that felt full rather than empty. The night continued quietly. Somewhere far away a dog barked, and the distant sound of a passing vehicle echoed briefly before disappearing again. The town around them was small, and by this hour most people had already gone to sleep. Rahman looked around the courtyard. The wooden furniture, the stone floor, the vines climbing along the walls. All of it had been part of his life for decades. Yet it felt different now compared to the lonely years before the young men had entered his life. He remembered evenings when he had sat here alone, listening only to the wind and the insects in the garden. Those nights had sometimes felt endless. But now the same courtyard was filled with conversation, laughter, and shared memories. Sammy suddenly stood up and walked toward the garden gate. He pushed it open slightly and looked out toward the dark road beyond the house. Do you ever think about leaving this place? He asked. Rahman thought for a moment before answering. I did when I was younger, he said. But eventually I realized that every place has its own story. I decided to stay and become part of this one. Arif joined Sammy near the gate and looked out into the distance as well. The road was empty, stretching quietly toward the hills. The world outside is huge, Arif said. Sometimes exciting, sometimes exhausting. Zion walked slowly toward them and leaned against the old stone wall. And sometimes, he added, people travel very far just to find a place that feels like home. Rahman watched them from the courtyard table. The three young men stood together near the gate, their silhouettes outlined by the pale moonlight. In that moment he realized how much they had grown since the day he first met them. They were no longer uncertain students wandering through life without direction. They had become confident, thoughtful individuals who carried their own stories and dreams. Yet despite everything they had seen in the world, they still returned here. After a while they all came back to the table again. Sammy sat down and stretched his arms across the back of the chair. I think the reason we keep coming back, he said, is because this place reminds us who we were before life became complicated. Arif laughed softly. Life was always complicated. We were just too young to notice. Zion looked at Rahman with a calm smile. But some people make life easier to understand, he said. Rahman felt slightly embarrassed by the comment but appreciated the sincerity behind it. You give me too much credit, he replied quietly. Sammy shook his head. No, we don't. The lantern light continued to glow warmly as the hours passed. Eventually Sammy grew tired and rested his head on the table for a moment. Arif stood up and walked toward the garden again, slowly pacing along the stone path between the trees. Zion followed him. Rahman remained seated, observing the quiet scene. The moon was now high in the sky, and its pale light covered the garden in a soft silver glow. The leaves of the trees moved gently, creating shifting shadows across the ground. Arif stopped near the old bench where they had sat earlier in the day. Do you remember the first time we stayed here overnight? He asked. Zion nodded. The storm. Arif smiled slightly at the memory. That storm changed everything. It had been years ago when heavy rain had flooded the roads, leaving them stranded in the town with nowhere to go. Rahman had offered them shelter without hesitation. What began as a simple act of kindness had slowly grown into a friendship that none of them had expected. Zion sat down on the bench and looked up at the moon. Sometimes history begins with very small moments, he said quietly. Arif laughed softly. You always turn everything into history. Zion shrugged gently. Because history is made of ordinary lives. Back in the courtyard, Rahman listened to their distant conversation and smiled to himself. He realized that even though he was older than them, he had also learned many things from their presence in his life. They reminded him that life could still hold surprises, even in later years. Eventually, the three young men returned to the courtyard again. Sammy had fallen asleep briefly but woke up when they approached. Did I miss anything important? He asked sleepily. Only another philosophical discussion, Arif replied. Sammy laughed and rubbed his eyes. You two and your deep conversations. Rahman chuckled quietly. Every group needs both thinkers and storytellers, he said. Sammy pointed to himself proudly. Then I am definitely the storyteller. The others laughed. The night continued in the same relaxed rhythm. Talking, laughing, remembering old stories, and imagining the future. No one noticed how quickly the hours passed. Eventually the lantern began to burn lower, and the first faint signs of dawn appeared on the horizon once again. Another night had quietly become a memory. As the early morning light slowly returned to the courtyard, Rahman looked at the three young men sitting beside him and felt a deep sense of gratitude. Life had taken many unexpected turns, but it had brought these friendships into his world. And as long as they continued returning to this old house, the story between them would keep growing, one peaceful night at a time.